Testing. Okie doke. Welcome. 14 August. dis&datInformation. theautonomouscollective.net. 1.2, Adorno, subsumption as total administration. A similar emphasis on the historical totalization of capitalist domination circumscribes Adorno's attempts to think capitalist subsumption in its widest social implications. Adorno and Horkheimer describe in Dialectic of Enlightenment a stage of totalitarian capitalism in which the reduction of the overwhelming mass of the population to mere objects of administration, Doge, which preforms every department of modern life, right down to language and perception, First Amendment, conjures up an illusion of objective necessity before which they believe themselves powerless. Footnote 44. The subsumption of individuals under capitalist relations of production has, for Adorno, integrated all internal human characteristics such that people are now totally controlled. Footnote 45. Retaining the more general philosophical sense of the concept, specifically that given to it the context of Kantian epistemology, Adorno's use of subsumption is not explicitly grounded in the technical distinction Marx makes between its formal mode and its real mode, or even limited to the labor process. As such, it is not deployed to denote a specific social content, but rather refers to a generic conceptual operation, quote unquote, identifying judgment, which, when applied to the context of late capitalist society, becomes synonymous and interchangeable with other related, and in fact, for Adorno, more socially substantive concepts such as integration and administration. For Adorno and Horkheimer, this generality of subsumption is key, however, because it manifests the connection incipiently present in Marx between conceptual abstraction and social abstraction, seeing them both as expressions of the same underlying tendency proper to Enlightenment reasoning, or Enlightenment reason, namely, of adequating the particular to the universal in a manner that liquefies any excessive individuality. Footnote 46. In this way, conceptual equivalence is read as an expression of the broad historical tendency to the systematic domination over nature, which lies at the root of all forms of domination, from class as the social subsumption of atoms to a general concept that expresses their constitutive as well as heterogeneous relations to the annihilating racism of Nazi Germany, which was founded on the complete abstraction of subsuming human beings under arbitrary concepts and treating them accordingly. Footnote 47. For Adorno, the primacy of the problem of subsumption establishes an inner unity between methodological concerns and political concerns. In the theoretical register, Horkheimer had already counted subsumption under universal concepts amongst the procedures of traditional theory, which he and Adorno contrasted to dialectics as a critical theory. Footnote 48. More fundamentally still, at the level of the social practice which determines theoretical consciousness, conceptual equivalents form the prevailing principle of reality of an administered world in the form of subsumption to the value form and commodity exchange. Footnote 49. It was Alfred von Rethel who had first suggested this connection to Adorno in the 1930s with his conception of exchange as a process of conceptual abstraction established not in thought, but in the action alone, and therefore a real abstraction, footnote 50. For Zonrethel, it was because exchange established equivalence in practice by wiping out the entire empirical reality of facts, events, and description, differentiating use values that equivalence in thought became possible. The social synthesis of diverse commodities affected by money, thus forming the material basis for the conceptual synthesis of disparate representations, footnote 51. Adorno, influenced by Zonrethel's idea of the unconscious but real conceptuality of exchange, highlighted this point in a seminar on Marx delivered in 1962, footnote 52. Quote, exchange itself is a process of abstraction. Whether human beings know or not, by entering into a relationship of exchange and reducing different use values to labor values, they actualize a conceptual operation socially. This is the objectivity of the concept in practice. Close quote, footnote 53. Because capitalist society is founded on the universalization of exchange, this subsumption of qualitative individuality under the value form, value form, becomes the objective abstraction to which the social process of life is subject. The Kantian equation of universal validity with objectivity is important here insofar as it establishes exchange as both the principle of social totality and correspondingly the basis for a theory of fetishism, footnote 54. Generalized exchange thus brings about a conceptuality which holds sway in reality itself, acting upon the vast mass of exchangers behind their backs as a law of survival, or not, as the case may be, binding them together and delimiting their activity through a monetary rather than directly practical nexus, footnote 55. As Bellafiore and Riva point out, for Adorno, exchange is the synthetic principle that immanently determines the connection of every social fact, and the principle of mediation that guarantees the reproduction of society through a process of abstraction. Footnote 56. It is this objective validity of the exchange abstraction that, on Adorno's account, becomes socially totalizing in late capitalism, governing not only the realms of governing not only the noisy sphere of circulation, but penetrating all those hitherto independent realms of life, independent from exchange relations at least, and subjecting them to total administration. The best known and enduring illustration of this diffusion of economic logic is the industrialization of culture, famously depicted in Dialectic of Enlightenment, that produces art's total subsumption under usefulness and the process of identifying, cataloging, and classifying that is fully realized in that which has been rigorously subsumed. Footnote 57. Tracing back the isomorphism between mental and practical abstraction, Adorno and Horkheimer argue that the culture industry's prime service to the customer is to do his schematizing for him, following the trend of mass production to replace a real act of synthesis with blind subsumption. It is, in this sense, an extension of the social function of money. Footnote 58, see Amazon. The individual, as object, becomes a site of colonization by the exchange relations they effect as subject. In a fascinating fragment from Minima Moralia entitled Novissimum Organum, Adorno suggests that, quote, the alteration of the technical composition of capital is prolonged within those encompassed, and indeed constituted by the technological demands of the production process. The organic composition of man is growing, close quote, footnote 59. These phenomena all express the extension of objective abstraction and correspondent industrial methods to every sphere of the social process. Such descriptions of the integrative effects of industrial logic resonate strongly with Marx's account of capitalist subsumption. For example, his portrayal of industrial labor as a specialization in passivity. For example, his portrayal of industrial labor as a specialization in passivity. One can indeed find occasional remarks which intimate a deeper reflection on the dynamic of capitalist subsumption on Adorno's part. For example, his assertion that the forces of production are mediated more than ever by the relations of production. The novissimum fragment referred to above, or when he describes a shift in the inner economic composition of cultural commodities, footnote 60. But in substance, a developed theory of subsumption is absent from Adorno's conception of modern domination. Indeed, it is primarily through the frame of exchange relations and their reifying power that the regime of total administration is conceived. If Adorno speaks of capitalist subsumption, then it is subsumption under the commodity form rather than capital that is at stake. The influence of Lukács, who treated the commodity as the central structural problem of capitalist society in all its aspects, looms large here. Footnote 61. Ingo Elba summarizes the limits of Lukács's approach. Quote, although the first to understand the character of capitalist rule the way Marx did, anonymous, objectively mediated, and having a life of its own, the founding document of Western Marxism, that is Lukács's History and Class Consciousness, avoids a reconstruction of Marx's theory of capitalism. Instead of an analysis of Marx's dialectic of the form of value up to the form of capital, which in the theory of real subsumption offers an explanation of the connection, so decisive for Lukács, between commodification and the alienated structure of the labor process, one finds merely an analogizing combination of a value theory reduced to the quantifying value form, value-form, due to an orientation towards Zimmel's cultural critique of money and a diagnosis oriented towards Max Weber of the formal rational tendency of the objectification of the labor process and modern law. Close quote, footnote 62. Whilst Adorno was skeptical of Lukács's romantic critique of reification as false consciousness, rather than it being the reflexive form of what is objectively untrue, these criticisms are broadly valid for his own understanding of the mechanisms of capitalist domination, insofar as he fails to theorize them beyond the level of exchange relations and equivalence in any comprehensive manner. Adorno's philosophically sophisticated account of the socialization affected by fetishism alludes to that decisive connection between exchange and production, in that historical materialism is the anamnesis of the genesis that critically deconstructs fetishized forms, whereas political economy succumbs to ideology by taking them at face value. Footnote 63. But, as his student Helmut Reichelt would later note, the full dialectical deconstruction of these forms remains in embryo in Adorno's writings and is limited to the terrain of asseveration, because the genesis of the commodity form is not constructed at the level of the social reproduction process in toto, or even followed through into an analysis of the production process, footnote 64, restricting it instead to the exchange principle. Adorno establishes the horizon of his theory of domination as the totalization of the fetish character of the commodity in an integrative apparatus of mass deception through which illusion dominates reality. Footnote 65. If then, for Negri, the completion of subsumption is dependent on the abolition of economic equivalence, raising production to the status of an ontological absolute, the inverse is true for Adorno, who puts forward a circulationist theory of subsumption in which commodity exchange provides the objectively valid model for all essential social events, and is the law which determines how the fatality of mankind unfolds. Footnote 66. As such, he too, like Negri, misses the critical, and as such, he too, like Negri, misses the crucial inner connection between exchange and production, commodification and valorization, in which the subsumptive dynamic of capitalist power is grounded. Footnote 67. This is especially clear in the way that Adorno theorizes the economic structure of domination in a world of total administration. For Adorno, human beings continue to be subject to domination by the economic process, in the face of which the individual is entirely nullified. At the same time, he notes the absence of a theory of surplus value or an objective theory of value adequate to late capitalism. Footnote 68. Whereas in the late 1940s, he described individuals as the mere agents of the law of value, it is not clear that for the later Adorno, the market continues to regulate capitalist domination in its totalitarian form. Horkheimer likewise wrote in 1943 of the now vanishing sphere of circulation and the gradual abolishment of the market as a regulator of production, such that the social process was no longer determined by anonymous processes, but rather decided or convened upon by elites. Footnote 69. In this, they were both influenced by Friedrich Pollock's idea of state capitalism, which asserted that liberal market capitalism had been replaced by a mixed or command economy ruled over by monopolistic conglomerates and bureaucratic structures, and that, as a result, the profit motive had been replaced by the power motive. The extent to which Adorno and Horkheimer adopted Pollock's theory is debated, yes. Deborah Cook, for example, argues that Adorno's concept of administration referred to in the manipulation of the welfare state rather than Pollock's all-encompassing state capitalism, and they certainly rejected his optimistic conclusions, the undialectic position that in an antagonistic society, a non-antagonistic economy was possible. But nevertheless, they clearly affirm the notion of a new era of capitalism in which domination did not take place solely or even primarily on the basis of anonymous economic mediations. Footnote 70. Back to Amazon again. Administration thus signals a purer and more integral form of class domination than the free play of market forces. Ironically, and in spite of his exaggerated emphasis on the formal moment of exchange, this leads Adorno to a conclusion similar to that of Negri, namely that in the absence, or at least qualitative diminution, of an autonomous mechanism of economic regulation, that is, value, capitalist command, that is, the steering of economic forces, increasingly becomes a function of political power. The totalization of capitalist subsumption brings about an indiscernibility, if in essence rather than appearance, of the economic and political moments, as relations of production have ceased to be just property relations. They now also include relations ranging from those of administration on up to those of the state, which functions now as an all-inclusive capitalist organization. Footnote 71. This view, however, scrambles the structural relations that distinguish and relate the different moments of the social reproduction process, as well as the different sources of social power in Marxist thought, unifying them under the rubric of a singular controlling logic that reduces individuals to simple objects of administration. See Doge. Quote, material production, distribution, and consumption are administered jointly. Their boundaries flow into one another, even though earlier within the overall social process, they were at once different from one another and related. And for that reason, they respected what was qualitatively different. Everything is now one. Footnote 72. This is Adorno. There is a degree, close quote, 70, footnote 72. There is a degree of equivocation in Adorno's writings about the completeness and character of this totalization, with different texts both across and within periods conveying different impressions. An illuminating comment from its 1969 preface asserts that the development towards total integration identified in Dialectic of Enlightenment had been interrupted but not terminated. Footnote 73. That Adorno and Horkheimer reserved terms such as total integration and the integral state to their discussions of Nazi Germany and the USSR gives us grounds to think that they distinguish between administered and dictatorial forms of subsumption, echoing Marcuse's repressive desublimation thesis, distinguishing the cultural forms of oppression in East and West. Although the distinction was not made programmatically, with the aforementioned cases considered expressions of the same underlying tendency. At a more methodological level, this ambiguity is qualified by an important difference between totality and totalization, connected to the fact that the unity of society is thought dialectically by Adorno as both true and untrue. True because there is no social fact which is not determined. There is no social fact which is not determined by society as a whole. Untrue because it projects a systematic coherence and completeness onto an incomplete and incoherent reality, one that is not in itself rationally continuous, nor at one with its subject. Footnote 74. Noting that the systemization in social sciences, that is traditional theory, merely mimics the real systematization of an administered world, the principle of Adorno's negative dialectics is to demonstrate the falseness of this whole. This is based on the non-identical opposition of society's character as both subject and object, that is, the product of human praxis, but also a structure existing independently over and against it. Society as subject and society as object are the same, and yet not the same. Footnote 75, and they break here. This is the negation of the negation stuff, right? Back to the text. Nonetheless, at a less abstract level, the exclusive dependency of Adorno's theory of capitalist domination on the exchange relation and its real abstraction raises the problem of closure on a different front, insofar as it elevates the principle of equivalence to a social absolute encompassing all mediating, that is, practically constitutive and transformative activities. The totality of the process of mediation. Footnote 76. The closure of other categories of social mediation that this presupposes, specifically those of production, not to mention those that external but essential to capital's accumulation process, theoretically extinguishes the dynamic of socio-technical transformation constituted between the relations and forces of production, and the forces of production that is decisive in modern society. The dynamic of subsumption, which grounds the reproductive unfolding of the social process under the conditions of capital, is therefore occluded by Adorno in favor of the irresistible progress of a vague but all-encompassing administrative apparatus. However, failing to grasp the internal logic of capitalist constitution as a process in motion, However, failing to grasp the internal logic of capitalist constitution as a process in motion leaves Adorno open to his own charge of immobilizing history in the unhistorical realm, and heedless of the historical conditions that govern the inner composition and constellation of subject and object, footnote 77. As Kroll forcefully argued, Krahl, Kroll forcefully argued Adorno's negation of late capitalist society has remained abstract, closing itself to the need for the determinacy of determinate negation, footnote 78. Now, this is partly due to Adorno and Horkheimer's view that the logic of technical rationalization deployed in real subsumption is simply a manifestation of instrumental reason, submerging capital's historically specific forms and structure in their meta-narrative of natural heteronomy, right? And change. Damn it. Uh, Sorry. This is partly due to Adorno and Horkheimer's view that the logic of technical rationalization deployed in real subsumption is simply a manifestation of instrumental reason, submerging capital's historically specific forms and structure in their meta-narrative of natural heteronomy, and partly to do with Adorno's methodological orientation toward negative critique elaborated above. The two tendencies converge in the text Negative Dialectics, where Kroll remarked, the concept of praxis is no longer questioned in terms of social change in its specific historical forms, footnote 79. In this way, Adorno's theory not only enacts a closure to the comprehension of actual social relations, but also to the possibility of their revolutionary transformation. For Kroll, Adorno deciphered origin and identity as the dominant category for the sphere of circulation, but the same theoretical tools which allowed Adorno this insight into the social totality also prevented him from seeing the historical possibilities of a liberating praxis, footnote 80. Instead, Adorno's thought suffers from an objective inadequacy in that it theoretically asserts the primacy of praxis whilst being simultaneously unable to register that praxis at the level of conjuncturally specific organizational categories, footnote 81. This more fundamental form of closure blocks the connection of social critique to a revolutionary horizon in Adorno's thought, which, despite remaining programmatically committed to a theoretical negation of subsumption, nonetheless lapses into an abstract defense of the non-identical that is at the same time bound to its foreclosure, footnote 82. By focusing solely on undoing the anamnesis of the Genesis, the critical deconstruction of objective illusion supplants practice. The critical deconstruction of objective illusion supplants practice rather than clearing the way for it or forming an organic moment in the construction of a new Genesis. As a result, Adorno's critique cannot but be mobilized as a radical defense of the individual, both the social individual and the individual work of art, which for him is the political other to the all-encompassing command of the identitarian capital state. This outcome both vindicates Kroll's charge that Adorno remained transfixed by bourgeois individuality, and also explains his retreat into the aesthetic as the privileged site of critique in an unfree society. That is, the question posed by every artwork is how, under the domination of the universal, a particular is in any way possible. Footnote 83. Well, if, however, a theory of subsumption is to supersede such closure and remain critical force, it must open itself to the determinate comprehension of the incomplete and therefore contestable processes of domination, as well as the forms of collective identity and action that would be the conditions for transcending those processes. Subsection 2, rejecting periodization. Whilst the theoretical positions presented in the work of Negri and Adorno are products of highly specific theoretical and political trajectories, they nonetheless serve to exemplify the contradictions and limits of an interpretation of subsumption that, number one, deploys it in an unmediated way to construct a periodization of capitalist society, and number two, asserts its completion in a phase of total subsumption marked by the breakdown of the core structural distinctions, particularly of the political and the economic, through which the social process is organized on a capitalist basis, i.e., those that give rise to the dynamic of subsumption in the first place. In following this, its latter form, we have seen how the reading of subsumption enacts a theoretical closure and overdetermination of the social process through its diachronic totalization of capitalist subsumption, foreclosing the possibility of further qualitative development based on capital's inner dynamic, as well as the possibility of a transcending praxis that is indissolubly bound up with that dynamic. In this context, Stuart Martin has noted the intense ambivalence that the contention of capitalist subsumption of life has produced within neo-Marxist and post-Marxist thought. Footnote 84. There is a stark contrast here between the pessimism of first-generation Frankfurt School thinkers, along with others like Baudrillard, for whom it marks the exhaustion of anti-capitalist politics, even its imagination, that is, the management of desires and growing organic composition of the human, and the quasi-theological optimism of Negri and other post-operists, for whom it demonstrates the very creativity and growing autonomy of living labor, which capital only subsumes as an increasingly thin membrane of control predisposed to disintegrate. That is the communism of capital, footnote 85. Yet, despite their divergent evaluations of its political repercussions, for both poles of this tendency, the historical completion of subsumption dissolves the possibility of an ongoing social struggle structured by the law of value, the distinction between living labor and labor power, and the distinct but interlocking mechanisms of capitalist power and state power. By doing this, these theories lose precisely what is critically forceful in the theory of subsumption: its specification of the structure and forms of capitalist domination and the points of antagonism at which the dialectic of integration transcendence unfolds. The terrain of conflict instead becomes vague and generalized as a single form of command, regulating the social process, whether ontologically or naturally historically conceived. As Martin argues, the consequences for the struggle against capitalism are self-evidently profound. The dissipation, if not outright negation, of the basic antagonism between living labor and capital. Footnote 86. These contradictions can be traced back to a number of basic theoretical inconsistencies and misconstruals of Marx's description of capitalist subsumption. Firstly, the distinction between formal, real, and hybrid subsumption made by Marx only applies directly to an individual production process. They are not concepts of social totality. This means that different capitals, branches, and forms of production can and will, in the same historical moment, operate at different levels of capitalist development, and furthermore, in uneven interaction with each other. Indeed, Marx says that as the process of subsumption matures in one branch of industry, it can act as a condition for the incipience of subsumption in another. It is not, therefore, plausible to totalize all production processes in society as being at the same conceptual stage of development. Even the same industries are subject to radical asymmetries in the structure of production, such that highly technical methods might be employed in some parts of the globe or aspects of the labor process, while extremely rudimentary methods still dominate elsewhere. The identification of forms of subsumption with phases of a social totality's development misconstrues the theoretical function of the distinction between them, which is to register change and difference in the relations between capital and labor at the level of a given production process. That is, to grasp conceptually the diverse and changing modes of social and material command employed by capital in the course of its expanded reproduction. The complexity of concrete configuration of subsumption forms and their dynamics of change is not only a theoretical postulate, it is documented in a vast number of empirical studies, footnote 87. Secondly, the forms of subsumption may be presented by Marx as logically successive, but this tells us very little about the actual chronology of their appearance or the necessity of their development in the context of a specific production process. Given that real subsumption is effective in even the most rudimentary rationalizations of the labor process, for example, in the implementation of cooperation, the historical gap separating formal from real subsumption is in many cases negligible, if present at all. The wage relation is established in the labor process is immediately subject to reorganization. By contrast, it is also the case that capitalists may maintain the labor process in conditions of formal subsumption or hybrid subsumption indefinitely, or even revert back to formal or hybrid methods, provided that it remains profitable to do so. Capital has no inherent imperative to technological progress for its own sake, only to accumulation. If there is a potential to increase profits, then capitals will introduce technical innovations. But if, for example, factors such as low wages and poor environmental and safety regulations keep the cost of production competitive, then there may be little incentive to do so. Both agriculture and extractive industries offer clear examples of this. Footnote 88. Let me break here for a second. Or, no, let me complete this. There is thus no necessary linearity to the transition between forms, only a competitive drive to maximize accumulation by whatever means possible. Let me break here for a second and say, yes, that's exactly why at this moment in time, renewable energies are being desubsidized in deference to making more profit in less renewable extractive industries, despite the fact that, technical superiority, health and safety, et cetera, environmental depredation, et cetera. Back to the text. Lastly, if it is implausible to posit a homogeneous stage of subsumption across all labor processes, then the claim to all of life or the social has been subsumed or is even more questionable. The developments brought about by real subsumption do, of course, have impacts that radically reshape the reproductive process as a whole. And theorizing these impacts demands going beyond Marx's account, but for them to be the effects of subsumption under capital, they must nonetheless be mediated through the distinct phases of exchange and production, the latter being the only meaningful site in which we can speak of real subsumption, rather than derived from one or the other alone. Much more fundamentally, however, to assume that a direct subsumption of life is possible is to collapse one of the central distinctions through which capitalist social relations are structured, that between living labor and the labor power commodity, and thereby jettison the theory of commodification. The thesis of a total subsumption conflates production and reproduction into one all-encompassing process with no exteriority, meaning that capital not only consumes labor power, but also directly produces it. Whether taken to its extreme as a completion or deployed more naively as an instrument of periodization pertaining to an ongoing process of capitalist development, it's clear that to historicize the forms of subsumption in any way is to suffuse the concept with an evolutionism by transposing a developmental logic immanent to the individual onto the whole without a sensitivity to the qualitatively distinct mediations operative at this higher level of totalization. A lot there. The effect of this is to reinstate a dogmatic, stagist conception of history internally to capitalism, and thus to situate the concept of subsumption within what Yaris Bonacci has referred to critically as the whole tradition of abstract historical formalism, footnote 89. It is clear that the theory of subsumption forms must be decoupled from any such attempts at crude and all-encompassing periodization. Equally, it is questionable whether anything other than the most heuristic and qualified periodizations can play a part in our understanding of the core dynamics of capitalist power. As Simon Clark points out, periodization does not solve the problem which gave rise to it, that of getting beyond the static fetishism of simple essentialist structuralism, because it merely proliferates structures which remain, each in their turn, equally static and fetishistic. Footnote 90. At any one time, capital's domination of the total social process must be understood as mediated and dispersed across a multiplicity of sites, each with their own determinations and results, as well as modulated by innumerable different empirical circumstances, natural conditions, racial relations, historical influences acting from outside, etc., whose effects cannot be prescribed in advance by a supra-historical theory, but demand close, concrete analysis. Footnote 91. A robust theory of subsumption would have to be open to all these sites and factors rather than homogenizing and overdetermining them, allowing the specific configurations of the reproduction process to come into view. As Sayer points out, rather than focusing on carving up history into abstract chunks, it is more important to establish the actual combinations of forces and relations of production that exist and work out how they cohere and function. Footnote 92. Number 3, subsection 3, systematic and reproductive totality. If we reject the assumption that the dynamic of subsumption can be used to meaningfully distinguish between different epochs or phases of capitalist world history, how can we conceptualize the relation between that dynamic of form determination and the process of society's reproduction development, that is, composition? How could we go about constructing a more mediated conception of capital's becoming that opens itself to further levels of complexity, both in terms of the real relations and conditions structuring the social process and the points of potential rupture and resistance to its rule by capital? What there? In the first place, this would seem to require relinquishing the problem of chronology, that of when or in what sequence the forms can be ordered, and instead positing a different one, that of the distribution, interaction, and development of subsumption forms. This would suggest, much more broadly, a turn away from a directly historical reading of Marx's categories encompassing a spectrum of positions from stagist orthodoxy right up to the heterodox Marxism that nonetheless deal with present conditions under the unifying and reductive rubric of quote-unquote real subsumption, and toward a systematic reading capable of comprehending the combination of categories and combination of relations within an internally differentiated conceptual totality. The concept of mode of production is the obvious referent here as the totality with which Marx is generally understood to have thought the unity of social forms and relations with each mode possessing its own historically unique laws of motion. Situating the forms of subsumption within such a totality and its laws would thus seem to hold the key to their comprehension on a social scale. Now, the initial problem with such an approach, raised in Chapter 2, is the instability and inconsistency of meaning Marx gives to the concept of mode of production in his writings, as numerous commentators have pointed out and extensive debates demonstrate. These meanings range from narrow descriptions of relations and methods of the immediate production process to an all-encompassing concept of social reality. In his discussions of subsumption, Marx tends towards the former. For example, when he describes real subsumption as giving the very mode of production a new shape and thereby creating the mode of production peculiar to capital, footnote 93. In this context, the concept of a specifically capitalist mode of production is associated exclusively with real subsumption, denoting a labor process that has been formed by capital in the course of its subsumption under the valorization process. This would suggest that Marx accords causal priority to the relation of subsumption, such that the mode of production is an effect of this relation. Elsewhere, Marx confirms this, according to a far broader effectivity to subsumptive relations than the mode of production, when he states that with real subsumption, a complete and constantly repeated revolution takes place in the mode of production, in the productivity of the workers, and in the relation between workers and capitalists, footnote 94. At other points, however, Marx inverts this picture and it becomes the mode of production that acts on the labor process and radically remolds all its social and technological conditions, footnote 95. Now, despite these slippages, the mode of production is clearly not simply acted upon by the relations that form it, but also generates its own social effects. With the introduction of large-scale industry, the capitalist mode of production has already seized upon the substance of labor and transformed it, footnote 96. In addition, the creation of a class with nothing to sell but their own labor power is due not only to the nature of the contract between capital and labor, but also to the mode of production itself, footnote 97. The reciprocity at work here recalls the infamous passage from the book Capital, in which Marx declares that, quote, the specific economic form in which unpaid, come on. The specific economic, quote, the specific economic form in which unpaid surplus labor is pumped out of direct producers determines the relationship of rulers and ruled as it grows directly out of production itself and in turn reacts upon it as a determining element. Footnote 98. Taken in the narrower sense that Marx employs in these passages, the mode of production cannot itself be the conceptual totality within which subsumption occurs, but forms only a partial moment or site of a broader totality incorporating subsumption relations and modes of production. In an important intervention in the 1970s debates around modes of production, Yaris Banerjee sought to resolve this difficulty by distinguishing sharply between two senses of the term in Marx's writings, a narrow conception limited to the labor process, as in the above citations, and a second, far broader conception of historical organization of production or social forms of production, Marx's own terms, footnote 99. According conceptual priority to the latter, Banerjee criticized the identification of a mode of production within or with a single mode of exploitation or subsumption, and instead proposed a much more expansive conception internally differentiated by diverse forms and configurations of exploitation. Quote, to take modes of production first, these for Marx comprise the relations of production in their totality, as he says in Wage, Labor, and Capital, a nuance completely missed by Marxists who simply reduce them to historically dominant forms of exploitation or forms of labor. For example, positing a slave mode of production wherever slave labor is used, or ruling out capitalism is free labor is absent. There's uneven development, right? The underlying assumption here is that Marx means by relations of production the relations of the immediate process of production, or what, in a perfectly nebulous expression, some Marxists call the, quote, method of surplus appropriation, unquote. But the immediate process of production can be structured in all sorts of ways, even under capitalism. Footnote 100. By distinguishing between a totality of relations of production and the multiple forms of exploitation found within and across various production processes, Banerjee conceives of modes of production as objects of a much greater complexity, impenetrable at the level of simple, i.e., general abstractions, that is, for example, formal subsumption and real subsumption. Footnote 101. This makes room for a much more nuanced understanding of capitalist totality that acknowledges the flexibility of combinations and diversity of forms, both economic and material, that its exploitation of labor takes. Quote, relations of production are simply not reducible to forms of exploitation, both because modes of production embrace a wider range of relationships than those in their immediate process of production, and because the deployment of labor, the organization and control of the labor process correlates within historical relations of production in complex ways. Close quote. The historiographic work undertaken by Banerjee not only offers illuminating illustrations of the complexities of this correlation, but also prompts fundamental theoretical questions that tarry, T-A-R-R-Y, to tarry, with the problem of subsumption at its root, acknowledging the diversity and complexity of forms of capitalist exploitation displaces the conceptual totality within which those forms are thought from the analytical level of mode of production, narrowly conceived, to an expanded notion of social relations of production. The ensemble of forms, roles, interactions, and interdependencies through which capital's accumulation process functions, i.e., capital itself in what Marx called its total process. However, the fundamental issue of mediation and reciprocal constitution between capital and its other, that is, labor and nature, is not resolved through such a displacement, which only gives us a new, definite totality of historical laws of motion. Footnote 102. The subsumption of labor forms an integral moment of this totality and must be analyzed as such, as undertaken in the previous chapter, but this still only leaves us with the abstract dynamic of subsumption as an effect of these historical laws, albeit one liberated from a narrative of linear historical evolution. Is even an expanded conception of social totality, be it a mode of production or social relations of production, adequate to the task of critically grasping the relation between the dynamic of subsumption in the labor process and the historical process of social reproduction development? Since the 1990s, a number of Hegelian Marxist scholars associated with the quote-unquote systematic dialectic perspective, most notably Christopher Arthur, have touched on this issue in seeking to develop a critical conception of capitalist totality. Footnote 103. Arthur's approach aims at a theoretical reconstruction of the capitalist mode of production's inner logic, drawing on a supposed homology between Hegel's logic, the text, and Marx's capital, the text, in order to develop a systematic dialectic of capital. Now, what is key in terms of the connection with Hegel here is the understanding of capital as an organic system, something which Marx himself asserted frequently, referring to the physiology of the bourgeois system, its internal organic coherence and its life process, footnote 104. For Chris Arthur, Capital's life process forms a logical totality in the mode of Hegel's idea, a self-moving system of abstract forms, which reproduces all the relevant conditions of its existence in its own movement. Footnote 105. This reproductive movement follows the logic of the value form given by Marx in the general formula M-C-M prime. But, Chris Arthur notes, in order to reproduce itself in this way, such that all presuppositions of the system are also posited by the system, capital has to take hold of production and reform it to match this end, which drives the dynamic of subsumption. QED, right? Quote, because the material reality of production is given to capital rather than created by it, capital has to shape this material into a content more or less adequate to it. This I call the form determination of the content. It cannot be achieved through formal subsumption alone. It requires real changes to the production process so as to make possible capital's fluidity in its other. Footnote 106. Let me break here for a second and say, yes, this is, what I was saying before about, on the one hand, you could interpret Luddism as machine breaking or resistance or, whatever. But you could also see that it's reformist in terms of social relations and other elements, including the wage, etc. Not simply, basic machine breaking. All right, back to the text. Chris Arthur's account is not entirely dissimilar to Marx's here, despite its hyper-idealized presentation in which conceptual developments are constantly driven by a logical necessity or the inadequacy of certain forms and relations to the existent totality in which they're situated. The problem with such an approach, however, is that a systematically totalized conception of capitalist relations of production appearing in Marx's words as an a priori construction is taken to be a closed logical totality within which relations of subsumption play out and can be explained instead of an open totality existing in perpetual tension with the external other that it struggles to absorb. That is to say, because Arthur comprehends the subsumption of labor from the standpoint of what is logically necessary for accumulation to take place, subsumption is treated as a mediation already internal to capital rather than a substantive mediation between capital and what lies outside it, labor and nature. Theoretically, this turns subsumption into the explanans rather than the explanandum, as the process of subsumption is characterized as a spontaneous function of capital grasped as a self-moving ideal structure, an abstract totality that imposes itself upon the socio-historical process unilaterally and automatically. Now, this is symptomatic of a return to a pre-critical understanding of subsumption, whose logical validity and the identity between particular and universal this implies requires no deeper analysis or further explanation. Now, where does Chris Arthur acknowledge that the system is prey to antinomies and is rooted in real differences? Opposites incapable of reconciliation, these antinomies and differences are only comprehended in the mode of their functional overcoming, in terms of what capital must do to meet its role of self-expansion. Yet Arthur perceptively admits that subsumption marks an aporia, a gap, in this ambition, and accordingly treats the forms of subsumption as mixed rather than pure categories for reasons of their material content. However, the qualification fails to generate new conceptual determinations regarding the process of capitalist domination. Thus, whilst the deconstruction of capital's repression of what is truly other is in order, this deconstruction is offered only in the most abstract terms in Chris Arthur's account, with labor's subjective potential for resistance and rupture appearing as nothing more than a postulate of contradiction. It's not clear in which way, if at all, this postulate could be further concretized via his closed functionalist model. As Werner Bonnefeld notes, Arthur rightly argues that the dialectical method deals with a given whole, and he wrongly treats this whole as a closed logical system. The peculiar character of capitalist social relations cannot be found in some logic of imminent abstractness. Footnote 107. the attempt made by authors such as Chris Arthur to integrate subsumption into a systematic dialectic of capital is significant because it threatens to impose a synchronic form of theoretical closure on the necessarily open relationship between subsumption and the reproduction development of the social form, the social formation. Arthur posits the radical separation of capital's dialectical and historical development, and in doing so concedes too much to Hegel and heeds Marx's critique of idealism too little. Capital may be an organic system, but it is not one with a truly independent, self-moving, and ahistorical existence. Whereas Marx criticized Hegel for considering the real as the product of thought, concentrating itself, probing its own depths, and unfolding itself out of itself. Capital is understood by Arthur to be structured in homology with Hegel's idea, leading to the reinstatement of this autonomous and one-sided developmental movement as capital's reality, footnote 108. Crucially, Arthur's interpretation is grounded in the assumption that right from its first sentence, as the object of Marx's Capital, the book, is indeed capitalism, meaning that capital's accumulation process, understood as a systematic totality, is identical in essence with a socially reproductive totality, and thus only has to posit itself through subsuming labor in order to secure its own actuality, footnote 109. Chris Arthur's view thus collapses the reproduction of society into the expanded reproduction of capital and correspondingly reduces the question of the relation between subsumption and social reproduction development to the question of the relation between subsumption and the essential relations of capitalist accumulation, i.e., back to our darn starting point. Chris Arthur is correct to assert contra Negri and Adorno that what is ontologically constitutive of capital is the process, not an originally given or finally accomplished state of reification, but his conception of processual openness is entirely devoid of material and historical determinations, footnote 110. Capitalist subsumption is a mediating synthetic category with practical historical conditions, practical-historical conditions and effects that are more complex than those functionally presented at the level of capital's expanded reproduction process in abstracto. It is precisely this excess of material effectivity that gives capital, through the real subsumption of productive forces, its unique and epoch-making power. Ignoring these, or at least relegating them to yet to be explored levels of concretion beyond the ontological ground of capitalism, misses the decisive role played by the dynamic of subsumption in the reproduction development of capitalist societies, reducing this couplet to just one of its poles, an empty, functionless notion of reproduction derived from capital's logic of accumulation. In this way, Arthur's pure dialectic of capital represses the theoretical comprehension of concrete development and is incapable of grasping systemic change, positing itself in opposition to a naive conception of empirical history. In this regard, Alfred Schmidt's comments regarding the relation between systematic and historical elements in materialist thought are strikingly pertinent. Quote, "The categorical expression of the relations of production investigated by Marx rested in a mediated and or unmediated sense on their history. To the extent to which the thinking process is autonomous in relation to its subject matter and does not slavishly copy it, it leads to theoretical construction. Further, to the extent to which this process remains objectively related to the material of history and continuously subjects itself to control so as not to ossify into an empty system, it approaches the level of a critical historiography. Both aspects, relative independence and dependence of the thinking process vis-a-vis the historical basis, belong together. Whoever has established clarity concerning the objectively contradictory relationship between history and system in the book Capital will not fuse, identify, or separate the historical and logical, but rather will seek to determine the weight and place of these moments in accordance with the level attained by the cognitive process. Footnote 111. I'll stop here because I'm now at subsection 4 in chapter 4 of the Saenz de Sicilia text. I hope I'm getting something out of this, and I hope you will. And let me stop here because we have other matters to deal with. But let me stop the live stream and stop the share.